Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Salvatore Rebecchini. I'm a member of the decision-making body of the Italian Competition Authority, who is in charge of enforcing antitrust law in Italy within the system of European competition network that is headed by the European Commission. My brief talk will try and give you some ideas and personal reflection on the issue of competition, innovation, and growth. These are three crucial elements that interact, and very importantly, and are at the fore of the activity of any competition authority. Let me start with a little quiz on terms of economic history, which I think is very interesting. Does any of you know, for instance, which was the first country to introduce in the 13th century the power-driven spinning machines that helped improve productivity in the spinning industry? Or the first country to use coal in blast furnaces for smelting iron, increasing dramatically the productivity of the iron industry? The first country to invent the wheelbarrow or the collar for horses, the rigid collar for horses to prevent choking and improve productivity? Well, this country was China. China had all of these technologies available back in the 13th century. But, as we know, economic history tells us that the industrial development and growth occurred in Europe, in the West, not in China. This is a very interesting, puzzling issue that economic historians have analyzed. And to put it very simply, the reason why Western Europe and not China has been summarized by David Landes, an economic historian at Harvard. And I quote him. Landes points out two main institutional factors hampering China's development. First, an overwhelming role of the state in carrying out economic activities, with very little room, if any, for private initiative. There was in China a whole array of state monopolies, which comprised the great consumption staples. There was a monopoly on salt, on the trade of iron, on the trade of tea, a state monopoly on alcohol, a state monopoly on foreign trade. And secondary element that Landes points out, there was a pervasive regulation. There was regulation of almost any type of human activity. Regulation on clothing, regulation of public and private constructions, regulation on the colors that one could wear in his own wares, regulation on music, on festival, all was regulated. It is a regime, concludes Landes, of paperwork and harassment, an endless paperwork and an endless harassment. This just to point out, in fact, how important is the free economic environment to enable a country to utilize at best its resources, including its knowledge resources, including its technology. So it is very important that a free economic competitive environment is there to promote growth. William Baumol, another important economist, has vividly illustrated this point in a seminal volume called The Free Market Innovation Machine. Baumol, and I quote him again, states that the free market pressure that forces firms into a continuing process of innovation, because it becomes a process of life and death for many of them, is the main power, is the main driver of growth. So I get to my point. The relationship between competition and growth has been widely analyzed in economic literature. And to sum it up, I would point to three main conclusions of this type of literature. The first conclusion is that market competition matters for achieving innovation, and through innovation, productivity increases, and through productivity increases growth. Total factor productivity was mentioned before by one of the previous speakers as one of the important elements missing or lacking in the Italian economy. One of the arguments that we can make, he called for the need to improve Italian productivity. One of the arguments we can make is to improve the competitive environment in Italy in order to increase the incentives, the drivers for productivity. The second important take from the economic literatures is that policies that help to open markets and remove regulation, you remember the example of China's, so reducing regulation or improving regulation or making regulation better are very important to promote competition. Regulation and competition are the two faces of the same coin. So good regulation makes for good competitive environment. Bad regulation makes for a poor competitive environment. And finally, what is very important also for growth is the link between competition law enforcement and the outcome in terms of growth. And by law enforcement, I mean not only the existence of a body of legal legislation on competition, but the actual enforcement, the way enforcement is carried out. So let me skip to the next aspect. When we talk about competition, what do we really mean? What is competition? In the history of economic thought and in the actual application, there are two main great notions of competition. One is a static view. Competition is a state of perfect equilibrium, where in a world of atomistic firms, small firms, very large number of firms, no one is able to exert any influence on the environment, on prices. So the firms just decide, the entrepreneur takes all of this environment as given, the prices available on the market, the conditions, and the technology, for instance, and he decides just on output. Given this structure of the market, I, as an entrepreneur, just decide on how much output I want to put. This can be the neoclassical, it's called the neoclassical view of competition, and it's basically a static model. As I said, the entrepreneur just takes the whole environment as given. It can be very significant to explain certain sectors, certain type of economic activities, but it's not maybe the most, I would say, realistic. The most realistic view of competition is the Schumpeterian view of dynamic competition. Schumpeter, in 1942, in his extraordinary essay called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, he criticized the relevance, the effective empirical relevance of the static competition model. And he spoke about a completely different type of entrepreneur. The entrepreneur that doesn't take the environment as given, and in fact, he is there to break the existing equilibrium conditions. In essence, the competition, as Baumol had said in my previous quotation, is a process of continuing dynamic destruction. The entrepreneur is a competitor because he wants to take advantage of novelties, of innovation. So in this view, dynamic competition, the effects of this type of competition are to produce new products, new services, new business models. And this is what drives, we go back to the first link, productivity, growth, and overall consumer welfare, consumer benefits, because you are able to enjoy new products, you are able to enjoy the same products as before at a lower price, you are able to perform the same activities with much more easiness. This is, in fact, also, as you can imagine, the type of competition that is occurring today in the highly dynamic sector of the new technologies, which very appropriately are called disruptive technologies, because they basically break the existing mode of business and the existing type of equilibrium. In this dynamic view of competition, there are two important implications that I would like to point out to you. The first is that the expectation of some sort of monopolistic power in pricing is the driver of competition and growth. A firm decides to invest because it knows that it can, in some sense, appropriate some of the returns of this investment because it will have, for some time, some monopolistic power. And this notion is very clear, for instance, in the US antitrust legislation. I just want to quote you a sentence from a decision made by the US Supreme Court in the United States in 2004 in deciding a case concerning the telecom industry. The US Supreme Court, a quote, said, "The opportunity to charge monopoly prices, at least for a short period, is what attracts business acumen in the first place. It induces risk-taking that produces innovation and economic growth." The second important implication of a dynamic view of competition is that monopoly today says little about what is going to be monopoly in 1, 2, 3, or 5 years. And here I just have to give you the examples of the, as I said, the new technologies. The story of our last decade is a story of apparently monopolistic enterprises that have been submerged and disrupted by new incumbents. Can I just mention you the story of Nokia? Do you remember Nokia? A monopolist dominant in the distribution and production of cell phones, disappeared. Do you remember, for instance, firms like Lotus 123 back 20 years ago that produced the first spreadsheet? He was a dominant firm, disappeared. Not to mention Dell or Hewlett-Packard, disappeared. Today, Google seems to be the great dominant firm. Well, Google today is subject to a lot of competitive pressure from Facebook in the market for collecting revenues from advertising. So you see, in a dynamic system, today's monopolist is not necessarily the monopolist of 2 or 5 or 10 years from now. So we come to the implementation. How important is for an antitrust agency to enforce antitrust law in such an environment? It's a very delicate business. We have to be very careful to enforce, to suppress, to deter harmful behaviors, but we also have to be very careful to avoid stifling, disincentivating the appropriate competitive environment and the appropriate incentives for a firm to improve and invest. This makes for us very difficult to assess and evaluate the dominance cases. As I said before, and the law recognizes that dominance per se is not an abuse. What is a sanctioned behavior is an abuse of dominance. There are certain conducts that are indicated. So when we look at dominance, we have to understand whether this dominance is abusing or not, is harmful for competitors and for consumers. Another important field which we are very much involved into is the fight against cartels. Cartels are the most harmful form of anti-competitive behavior. Cartels are very widespread and are becoming, I think, more and more utilized in the system, especially because cartels are often the response, the reaction to sectors that are facing structural crisis. There is a tendency within a sector that is facing structural crisis because of the change of the economic environment, the technology, and so on and forth, to defend itself through collusive horizontal behavior. Now, my message here is that, again, horizontal agreements are not per se a misconduct. They can be justified for instance, efficiency reasons. It is very important, however, that such horizontal agreements are designed and conducted in a compliant fashion. There is a lot of investment that has been done in order to optimize compliance with respect to antitrust law in terms of what can be agreed upon in horizontal agreements. There is a very delicate issue about the exchange of information, for instance. It can be conducive to an antitrust case. It can be perfectly legitimate. So my message here to players, important players in an important sector like the financial sector is please be very careful and be very attentive to the issues of compliance, because it can make the difference between sanctions and no sanctions, because all of the behaviors per se can be perfectly legitimate and all of the behaviors per se can be harmful. It is very important in how the agreement is designed. The efficiency arguments are very important. We, as antitrust authorities, are very much willing to hear efficiencies argument. If a firms come to us or a group of firms come to us and tell us, we are going to do this and this, or we did this and this, because there are efficiencies that can be derived from this behavior, and these efficiencies are passed down to the consumer, to the final beneficiaries, to the second layer players, we are very willing to understand this kind of arguments. It's a delicate argument. It requires a lot of economic analysis and good quantitative proof, but it's not an impossible task. This is a great lesson, by the way, from the Chicago School of the United States, this issue of the efficiency arguments. Finally, another important message I would like to give you. The whole economic environment is more or less pro-competitive, not only because of the antitrust enforcement of the antitrust legislation, but because, as I said, of the regulatory environment. And you as a financial industry are a highly regulated industry, and unfortunately, I think now there is too much emphasis on these issues of re-regulation. I think the regulation is very important. Just a few considerations on what would be the appropriate type of regulation, and then I will conclude. I think regulation should aim at specifically well-defined objective of general interest: health, environment, individual right, financial stability. Regulation should be proportionate and should be kept to the minimum necessary to fix what are precise in the market failures. It should take into account the anti-competitive effects. A good regulator should always have the, I would say, the humility of undergoing a sort of analysis or check or whether, what are the competitive implications of its regulation. Should not be focused on short-term objectives, and most importantly of all, the regulator should be kept safe from regulatory capture problems, which is one of the most delicate issues. That means that regulators should enjoy a highly autonomous, independent status and structure of governance. Thank you very much for your attention.